Good morning. Just in case you don't remember, I'm Father John. At the moment, I'm the pastoral consultant to the Eight Saints parishes here in Cornwall. Like the rest of you, I'm in lockdown, shut in at home, and so I hope that you're all well and safe in your home on this Monday in Holy Week. Holy Week is the week when we closely follow our Lord as he follows the way of the cross, right up to his death on that cross and beyond to Easter Day. This week, I'm going to try to offer you a daily homily. I hasten to say that these are not entirely my own words, but those of a late superior of the Community of the Resurrection, Father Hugh Bishop. There were talks that were broadcast by the BBC as long ago as 1955. I first heard them as a student when the Community of the Resurrection sponsored me in my vocation. They're words that really hit home to me. And if you follow me week by week, maybe they'll help you to understand our Lord and our God. You'll see that I'm really dressed for radio. So listen carefully. If the picture of me really bores you to death, then close your eyes and it'll be as if we're listening to the radio. I'll read them and hopefully day by day get their message, and I hope it will impress itself upon you. So Father Hugh writes, "The story of the human race is a love story, the story of how man was made for God and then proved to be unfaithful and deserted him, until at the last, after an almost incredible series of heroic adventures, our divine lover succeeded in rescuing us." And he writes, remember this was written way back in 1955. He says, "Some years ago I read an account of the raising of an American submarine. So far as I remember, it happened somewhere about 25 or 30 years ago when, I suppose, the task the divers had to tackle was a good deal more dangerous than it would be today with more modern equipment. In charge of the operation, there was a young American naval officer. He felt acutely not only his responsibility for the work, but also the fact that he remained in safety on the bridge while his men risked their lives below the surface. So when winter came and the work had to stop for a time, he spent the next few months being trained as a diver. Then when the work was resumed, he insisted on taking his turn with his men and going over the side with them and sharing their dangers below the sea. Well, at last the operation was completed and the submarine was successfully raised. But before the crew went on leave, they all gathered on deck and each of them shook hands with the young commanding officer, and then one of them, speaking for the rest, said, 'You know, sir, there isn't a man among us who wouldn't willingly do anything in the world for you.' Well, that gives us some sort of clue to the part the divine hero took in this other true story, which is played out during this week. You see, man, through his desertion of God, had got himself into a mess from which he couldn't rescue himself. When that happened, God wasn't content to give us good advice and direct the rescue operations from the bridge, or merely send his messengers to help us. But he himself came down from the bridge and went over the side himself, without privilege or safeguard, and not only risked, but gave his life for us. Now, I expect you've sometimes heard people say that the church has complicated and spoiled the simple gospel story by introducing complicated dogmas which claim that Christ was God. But you know, it's Christ himself who makes these claims. And whatever else we say about them, the one thing we can't say is that it doesn't really make any difference whether you believe they're true or not, so long as you accept his teaching and try to follow his example. It makes all the difference in the world whether you believe those claims are true or false. Just think. It would have been a very wonderful thing if the being who made this unimaginably vast universe had sent messengers of some sort to tell us how much he cares. It would have been still more wonderful if he himself had somehow appeared in all his power and glory in some wonderful manifestation of his presence, and himself assured us of his love. But neither of these two things can compare with the wonder of what actually happened when God himself became man and went down the same rope with us without privilege or safeguard, because he loved us as much as that. You can read in the good book, "Hereby know we love, because he laid down his life for us." He didn't talk about it or profess his willingness to do it, but he did it. He proved his love for us in deeds, not words. And that's just the difference between the God of Christians and the God of all those who stop short of affirming that Jesus Christ is God. The God whom I worship was born in a stable of Bethlehem, and 33 years later was arrested one night, and, after a trial which was a mockery of justice, he was beaten up and savagely scourged and eventually nailed to a cross and crucified, because he so loved the world and every human being in it. And the God whom all others worship, whatever else they may believe about him, was not born at Bethlehem. He was not arrested or beaten up or scourged. He did not stand defenseless before Pilate, and he did not give his life for us. And the difference between the two is that we have in the Passion of Christ the proof of the measure of God's love for us. You see, the Passion isn't just a beautiful parable or myth. It actually happened. God has loved and is loving us as much as that. There is no point at which his love stops. There are no conditions or reservations. It says, having loved his own, he loved them unto the end. And the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. Could you keep that sentence from Galatians in mind today? And from time to time repeat it to yourself and think about it while you're doing your work, or even tonight lying in bed. The Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. As you think about it, two facts emerge, don't they? First, what matters most is not our love for God, which is so feeble and so uncertain, for in fact, we don't love him very much, but his love for us, so strong and so unfailing. That's what makes all the difference and will in the end determine our destiny, please God. How many times have I tried to wash my hands of the whole thing, wrote George Tyrrell, but always that strange young man on his cross drives me back again. Well, I expect a lot of us, one way or another, have tried at times to forget or escape from his love, because it is a weight of glory which we can hardly bear. But the love of God is the kind of love which refuses to let us go. It's pursued you down the years, and believe me, it's still pursuing you now. You may have made an awful mess of your life. You may be very lonely or unhappy or in pain, or you may be just the usual mixture of good and bad. But here is something on which you can always rely. Neglect him or ignore him, deny him or betray him as we will, he still goes on loving us, for there's literally no limit to his love for us. And therein lies all our hope. And the second fact we can't escape is this: love wants to be loved. We've all found that out ourselves. You wouldn't be listening to me now, I expect, if you didn't believe in God and want to love him. So the failures of love which he has to endure from us don't usually take the form of open hostility or opposition, do they? Except, of course, when his will crosses ours. But there's something that wounds his heart no less, and that's the neglect and the indifference, or the purely conventional churchmanship, church-going even, as a habit, which is our usual response to the love which blazes from the cross. So I want to end by telling you two more stories. The first is an old medieval story about the devil questioning three of his subordinate spirits before he sent them out into the world. So he asked the first, "What will you say to men?" And the first replied, "I shall tell him there isn't a God, so why worry?" "No, that's no good," the devil answered. "Most of them will never believe you for long." So he asked the second, "What will you say to men?" And the second said, "Oh, I shall tell them that I dare say there's a God, but he's far away in heaven, and he's not interested in what goes on in this tiny little planet or what happens to people like you and me." And the devil replied, "No, that's no good either. They've all heard about Bethlehem and the cross, about Christmas and Easter." So he asked the third, "What will you say to men?" And the third said, "Oh, I shall tell them that I know that there's a God, and I dare say it's true about Bethlehem and the cross. But after all, what does it matter?" And the devil laughed and said, "Yes, that's right. That's what you must say to them." And that's what he does say. Suppose the passion is all true. Suppose this God does care as much as that. You never asked him to. Don't let's start taking religion too seriously. After all, what does it matter? And my last story is a story which a famous Archbishop of Paris used to tell. A number of youths were strolling round the square at the west end of the great cathedral of Notre Dame, not knowing what to do with themselves. Someone suggested that it would be rather a lark if one of them went into the cathedral and made a bogus confession to the priest there, accusing himself of all the worst sins he could think of, just to see what the priest would say and do. Well, it seemed a very clever idea, and quite a daring thing to do, so one of them went and did it. When the boy had finished, the old priest looked up and said to him, Go and kneel at the foot of that crucifix over there, and look at Christ, and then say deliberately and slowly, 'I know you died for me, and I don't care a damn. Then come back here and ask me to give you God's forgiveness.'" I know that story's true, the old Archbishop would say, because I was that boy. And when you come to think about it, when you look up at that figure on the cross, there are really only two things which you can say. You can either say, "Well, what does it matter? I know you died for me and I couldn't care less." Or you can say, "There isn't a single one among us who wouldn't willingly do anything in the world for you." And in Holy Week, I think we're forced to give one answer or the other. But let's be practical. What do you think God is asking you to do, even at this time of COVID-19, as a practical expression of your love? Will you seriously ask that question of yourself today? Is it some prompting of your conscience in some matter or other which you've been trying to ignore, which you've now got to obey? Life is short, as we know it in these times. If so, will you take the necessary action this week? It may be concerned with some big thing in your life, or some seemingly quite small thing. Is it something to do with your personal relationships, or your work, your life at home, your prayers, or your worship that he wants you to do something about? Anyhow, will you ask him to show you how he would like you to express your love? And in order to give God a chance to answer, will you spend a few minutes sometime today thinking quietly about what I've been saying and trying to realize a bit more? That is, trying to make a bit more real to yourself the length and breadth and depth and height of the love of God for you. Read the Gospels, the Passion story, and you'll see the lengths that God went to. The Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. If the divine hero loves me like that, there's hope for me yet. Thanks be to God. Think about these things. Speak to you again tomorrow.